So when we say that the judges can produce law in the form of judgments, in the form of some ratio, they also interpret the law, which already is made by Parliament. And their task is actually in application of that law, interpretation and construction. If you can a little bit tell us about those 3 points, especially what is the difference between interpretation and construction?
So interpretation it will help actually when we move on to the next slide to talk about interpretation. But this is how we effectively read the rules that are actually in the legislation itself. It's how we read them, how we interpret them. When we talk about construction, we're talking more about approach. So it's construction, I would say the approach is more broad than just the interpretation. We have interpretive rules, as we see. Sorry, Olga, I need to jump between the slides again. Interpretive rules like here, the literal rule, the golden rule, the mischief rule. Construction is more about approach, where we have things like a literal approach or a purposive approach, which beneath, I would say, sit things like the literal rule, the golden rule, mischief rule. So that is broadly the difference between the two, construction and interpretation.
So can you a little bit tell us more about those rules? What is the difference, if there's any, which is a starting point possibly from that, which we should consider first, and something an alternative?
The best one, I think, to start with, as we have on the slide, is the literal rule, because it shows what can go wrong if you just apply a literal interpretation to everything and say these are the exact words that are used in the statute, and this is my literal interpretation. A lot of things can go wrong. And there are some quite interesting cases for this as well. So there's a case concerning a car park and whether or not a car park is a road for the purposes of the Road Traffic Act. And the court effectively looked at it and said, well, it's a car park, it's not a road. The Road Traffic Act doesn't apply. That is a literal interpretation. There was one case as well, it's an old 19th century case called Whiteley v. Chappell, where somebody had effectively committed voter fraud. They had voted in an election by pretending to be somebody who had died. They'd stolen their identity, and they were charged with impersonating that person. The actual wording of the statute said that it was an offense to impersonate someone who was entitled to vote. And he said, well, this person is not entitled to vote because he's dead. The law was literally applied, and they said, yes, you're right. That person was not entitled to vote. They were dead. So you did not impersonate a person who was entitled to vote. So this is one of the things that can go wrong if we literally apply the law. That clearly was not the intention when the law was drafted.
So this is more like language related, if I summarize.
It is, yes. It's how we actually choose to interpret the words, the language that is used in the statute. The golden rule is a little bit somewhere in between the literal rule and the mischief rule. We're applying to words in a statute their ordinary meaning, still in a literal sense, but we're interpreting them in the way they would normally be used in the present day, in a particular context, to avoid things that would be absurd. So one case that we have here as an example is called R.V. Allen, where it's a bigamy case. So somebody had tried to marry multiple people, the offense of bigamy. And he had tried to argue that technically you cannot legally marry more than one person. So he could not have committed bigamy because the other marriages would have been invalid after the first. Now, the court looked at that and said, well, if we apply this literally, the offense of bigamy could never be committed because no person could legally marry more than one person. So they gave it its ordinary meaning, which was to go through the marriage ceremony, to commit as if you were married, in which case the offense of bigamy could actually be committed. So that is the golden rule. We also have public policy considerations often in the golden rule. There's a case, for example, where a man murdered his mother and would have been otherwise entitled under the rules of intestacy to her estate because she had died without making a will. The court in that case chose a slightly different interpretation of the word issue. he would have been considered her issue otherwise and have been entitled to inherit her estate. So that is the golden rule.